Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today with Darin Haener. My name is Angela Molina, I'm from SitePoint. I'm the course commissioner and I will be hosting today's event. So, welcome. Today we have Darin joining us in this webinar today. He has been creating courses for us at SitePoint. The latest one has been on React and ES6. I'm not sure if you've completed the course, got it started. If you're here because you're interested in learning about React, today Darin will be joining us and talking about migration changes, breaking changes in particular with React. So I believe that you have a presentation prepared for us. You're going to be talking to us about that, correct?
Indeed, I do. Yeah. So are we ready to go?
I think we are.
Okay.
Let's get started.
I'm going to talk today about breaking changes when migrating versions of React. As we know, the JavaScript world moves super, super fast, and there's not always good documentation about when breaking changes happen. I'm probably not the only person to have run npm install and then have a random package break because the API changed. Fortunately for us who use React, the people at Facebook are very, very good about giving deprecation warnings and not breaking things immediately, even though it still does happen every once in a while. So we're going to start. I want to start by talking about deprecations that happened from React 12 to React 13. So all of these deprecations didn't break when you started using React 13, but they will break when you upgrade to 14. So it looks like there's still quite a few people using 13, so I think this is probably pretty relevant. So the first thing that happens that was deprecated was mutating props after an element is created. So when creating a React element, nowadays props are considered to be immutable, meaning you can't change them. So I'm going to jump out of this real quick and go over. I have some code samples. So the first thing you'll notice here is that we're creating a component with the standard React create class. And when the component mounts in that callback, I'm changing the props here. This used to be allowed, but this will now raise a deprecation warning. It's still allowed in 13, but it's going to raise a warning in your JavaScript console saying that you can't mutate props. And in 14, it will throw an error. You're not allowed to do it. The next thing would be the component class type is also deprecated. This was a way to introspect into what type of class the component is, and now all you have to do is just compare it with the component class, and React will handle that just fine. So you can just drop the type, and you don't need that anymore. Third things, plain objects are no longer supported as React children. So you can no longer pass in just a plain JavaScript object as a child. It must be an array now. If we look at this component here, you used to be able to just pass in, if you only wanted to add one child, you just pass in one child, but now it's required that it be an array, this is perfectly valid right here. Just putting your children into an array like that. The preferred way, React gave us this create fragment helper that allows us to just pass in as many as we want, and this also, the create fragment helper also gives you some performance benefits, because if you were to change the order in which these children are in this array and just using an array, React would re-render the entire component and both of its children. Now with create fragment, if you rearrange them and move this left down so it's now the second component, you'll just flip them without completely re-rendering everything. So it's a little more performant and better to do this way. The next thing that was deprecated would be ES6 class component methods. So what we're talking about here, there's a whole bunch of methods that you can use when you use this React create class syntax that you can't use in ES6 classes. ES6 classes were introduced in React 13, and so this .get DOM node, trying to find the actual DOM node that was rendered, this is actually deprecated now. This is how they prefer you to do it now, using the React.find DOM node, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the 13 to 14 migration, because that's changing even more. That's pretty much the biggest one. I find a lot of people use this one, and so being able to this is a big one that people use that needs changing. There's a few others. Setting props, replacing state has been removed entirely. They didn't even deprecate it, so you cannot use that in an ES6 class. Is mounted has been completely removed. Again, cannot use it in an ES6 class. It's still available if you create your component using the React.createClass method, but if you're using ES6 classes, it's just not there at all. Set props is also removed. They removed this in favor of just setting the properties as just a value on the instance of the component, so it's just this.props. And also replace props has been removed, and which is also being deprecated in their create class. Okay, so that covers most of the 12 to 13 deprecations. Most people, I think, are on 13. So these things, this next list is what's going to break when React 15 comes out, hopefully in the next month or so. So one thing, get DOM node, even though they initially said this is going to be removed, they still list it as deprecated, and so it is slated to be completely removed in 15. So using get DOM node is no longer a thing. You used to be able to get away with creating a component, a class component, without extending the React component. Probably made it very hard to actually create a component, but now they actually must, in React 13, they must extend a React component that would be deprecated in 13, and in 14, you cannot create an ES6 class without extending the React component. That actually looks like this. So it must extend that React component. And then jumping back to the get DOM node, you can see that that's still deprecated. This is how we want to do it, but now there's in React 14, there's not a huge use case for this, because if you add a ref, typically you find a DOM node by its ref, and if you add a ref like this to this span, now if you just say this.refs.foo, because it's an actual HTML attribute, in React 14, it will return the actual DOM node when you call this.refs.foo, so there's no reason to use React find DOM node anymore. The other thing that has been deprecated is reusing and mutating a style object. So this, let's say we want to change the color of some text here in this render method based on the state of the application. And I just created a little button here to say just pick a random color from this array. If we try to set the state on that, it will work, and your style will be updated in this version, but it's going to trigger a deprecation warning because they want to treat the style objects just as you would props. In React 14, props are immutable. You cannot change the props after they've been created, so they're moving the same direction with style objects. And the preferred way to do that is to actually clone the component and update and just mount a brand new component as opposed to mutating the state. It's part of their push towards having stateless components and pure function components. The last piece is clone with props. So clone with props is now deprecated. It'll still work until React 15, but the preferred way now is to use React.clone element. They work fairly similarly. The API, as you can see, is pretty much the same, but the difference being that clone with props would actually merge in props and style tags, style objects like this. So if our original props had some style on it, it would actually merge it in using clone with props, but with React clone element, it's all completely replaced. There's no merging happening. So if you want to merge your style or your props from the previous element to the new element, you have to do the merging yourself. And so that's pretty much it for 14. Not a lot of huge breaking changes here. And React actually, they put out a really nice tool here called React Code Mod that allows you to go through and make these changes just using a script. So I'm not going to go into the details. They have really great documentation here, but a really nice tool to allow you to just run a script and update all your breaking changes. So for instance, the find DOM node, it'll update this.get DOM node to this.rest.foo.get DOM node. Quite a few other ones. Another big change that React 14 introduces that 15 it will be a breaking change is the split between React and React DOM. So React DOM now does all the rendering, and React itself just takes care of all the internal stuff as far as the virtual DOM and re-rendering and tracking the state of the application. They made this move in order to make components more reusable across different platforms, and namely to be used with React Native. Deprecated now, you can still call React render, but in 15 you're going to have to use React DOM.render. That's pretty much it. The React conference just wrapped up, and they gave us just a few little tidbits of what's coming in 15. And you'll notice it's now called 15.0. It is not 0.13 and 0.14. They did this for a variety of reasons. They wanted to skip 1.0 because I guess they felt it wasn't special. And they wanted to have a more fine-grained semantic versioning so that they could release a 15.1, a 15.1.1. And since everyone already called it React 13, React 14, they figured that 15 was the most logical thing to do. So in 15, I don't know about any breaking changes yet, but I do know you're not going to have any more React IDs in your markup. So if you're used to seeing all these crazy React IDs on every single attribute, that'll be gone. They're managing that in a different way. There'll be no more spans. So previously unwrapped text got wrapped in a span tag by default. They won't be doing that anymore. So your markup's going to look a lot nicer and more like the way you actually create it with JSX. And no more Internet 8 support. They decided to pull the plug on that when Microsoft decided to stop supporting it. So I'm sure all the developers out there are breathing a sigh of relief for that. So that wraps it up for just this brief overview of how to migrate your React applications and what to expect in the coming days.
Thank you for presenting that. I noticed that a few people have mentioned having a few difficulties with the quality of the screen. I believe that if you go on YouTube, you could also change the settings so that you can see it at a higher quality. There is a link in the chat, so if you have having problems with that, definitely go in and do that. But the floor is now open for your questions, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in chat and I will send them across to Darin. But my question for you, Darin, is you've been talking to us about having migration, about the changes in React. So my question to you is, have you experienced any issues so far, and what have you done to kind of resolve them? Like, what projects have you been working on?
Yeah, I think the biggest issues I've run into are when I started using React 14, and they split React and the React DOM modules into separate pieces. And with that move, they also split apart several of the add-ons into their own modules. So not everything was included in when you just import React into your JavaScript file. Not everything is automatically included. So you have to install several different modules, which is nice. It's more fine-grained, and you don't have this big all-inclusive package where you may not be using some of the features. But also, a lot of stuff breaks because things that were automatically included before are not included. So that was a pretty big one. And then the Git DOM node change was a pretty big one for me. I found that in a lot of places in my code where I had to switch it over to the find DOM node. And I didn't know about that tool when I made all those changes, unfortunately. So, so I had to go through and do them manually.
Great. So just to get people started, I know that you also created the React course on Premium, SitePoint Premium, that is. How did you find the experience? Like, what made you get into React? Why did you choose to start learning it?
Yeah, so it was actually about a year ago. I started working at a new company, and they were completely a React shop. I wasn't forced to do it. I was hired as a Ruby on Rails developer, but when I started working with it, I loved it more than any other JavaScript framework I've ever played with or ever used. It just made sense to me to keep your markup, the JSX, in the same place as your business logic. That's always been frowned upon pretty much in the community, and it just makes sense to me to have everything all wrapped up in one place, making these small reusable components and the framework takes care of all the re-rendering for you, which is nice.
Why do you think it was frowned upon?
It's just kind of been the way for many years, is to separate concerns. So your HTML belongs in an HTML file, and your JavaScript belongs in a JavaScript file, and it's just projects have been organized that way for a long time. Just like a REST client, the whole REST architecture where you have these specific URLs. It's been that way for a long time, and Facebook right now is also trying to completely disrupt that too. So it's just a different way of thinking, and it worked with my brain. I don't know, it just made sense to me.
Very good. We have a question from H. Fennell, and he wants to know, he's new to React. Could you give him an example of what kind of applications you could build with React? Like, what can you do with it? Why would people want to start using it?
Right. You can really build most anything with it. It's not limited in any way. The to-do list is always the popular one, and it's always the way that they're comparing JavaScript frameworks. That may, if you're a complete beginner and you don't know a lot of JavaScript, that may be too much to start with. I think what I created, the reading time widget that I created in my course, was really simple and a great thing to start with, and then maybe move on to a to-do list from there. But as far as Facebook is using it in production. That means something, and it's a very high-speed, performant view-only framework. So it's super flexible. You can tack on all the different types of components that you want. It's not a one-size-fits-all package.
So you would say it's its flexibility then?
Yeah, it's very flexible.
Mm-hmm. Daniel's got a question. What's your view on people that jump straight into JavaScript frameworks before they learn how to build web apps in just JS?
I think that's fine. I think it's probably a good way to bridge the gap between not necessarily knowing all these underlying things. I started my web development career by just jumping in to a framework, which was Ruby on Rails at the time, but I think that still applies for JavaScript. I didn't know the language. I didn't know really much about programming web applications, but using a framework allowed me to jump in and see results immediately. I didn't have to spend 4 or 5 days banging my head against the wall, getting some sort of boilerplate code set up. I could jump right in. I could see some results on my web page. I can then, through the framework, start learning about the language itself and getting more acclimated with the language. So, I mean, I think personally that was my experience. That's how I learned it, and I think it's a fantastic way to introduce yourself to something.
Okay. Talking about introducing yourself into something, Shikar says he's created a few apps using Redux in React, but still cannot digest the ES6 style. Any advice for him?
Well, I would suggest maybe branching out to another programming language. It's very the ES6 style is it's class-based. It's very object-oriented based, and it's very similar to like Python or Ruby, how those languages are structured and they work. So that would be my suggestion, is to look at another programming language and see kind of how they work. Makes it easier to bridge that gap. As I think probably a lot of JavaScript programmers come from maybe a functional mindset, and so it can be kind of hard to wrap your head around the class-based application style.
Okay. And what is your view on using React to build web applications?
Well, I'm pretty biased about it. I don't know that I'll use anything else for the foreseeable future to build web applications. It's very well supported. I really like how Facebook is completely disrupting the entire web development world. First with co-locating HTML markup and JavaScript code, and now with the work they're doing with GraphQL and Relay, they're just out to change the world, and I really like it. It's really exciting.
Alexandra wants to know, are there any plugins that you know of that can help him manage sessions?
Managing sessions. That's a tough one. There's a lot of plugins out there, and I can't say that I am 100% fond of really any of them. I do prefer to do things. I typically use Koa as my web server, which is built by the Express team, and they have a plugin that's just part of their module system. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but Express has kind of the same thing. So no, off the top of my head, I cannot recommend a really good one. They all have their pluses and minuses, so unfortunately.
That's all right. If you are in the chat watching this webinar and you have any suggestions for that question, feel free to add it into the chat session. Do you have any thoughts on how hard it would be to jump into ES6?
I think if you have some basic knowledge of JavaScript, it wouldn't be too hard. I think coming from maybe no JavaScript knowledge and just learning how to program, probably not like some of the more advanced features. There are some features that are kind of hard to wrap your head around. But there's also a lot of very low-level, simple features that just make your life easier, like template strings. So instead of having all these different quoted strings with a bunch of pluses in between, you can interpolate like you can with other languages. So I don't think there's a really high barrier of entry to learning ES6. Just depends on. Just don't jump into the deep end.
Yeah, yeah. So what are your thoughts on the upcoming ES7 then?
I like a lot of the features. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of contention with some of them, and
Mhm.
so it's hard to jump in and use a lot of them
Mhm.
because some of them just may be yanked from the specification. Like decorators, for one, was something that I really like, but recently Babel removed it from their compiler, so because it may or may not be part of the specification. So um, use at your own risk, I think.
Mm.
Some of the stuff is pretty safe, like static variables on classes is pretty safe. Um, I think all the spread operators that are coming are pretty safe, but something like a decorator, use at your own risk.
Yeah. Good. Shakar has another question for us. Do I need to learn new syntaxes every year if I'm a JS programmer because it's evolving so fast every year? How do you go about that? How do you continuously keep your learning cycle going?
Yeah, that's a great question. You really have to.
Mm.
It is changing fast, and it's not necessarily just that the syntax is changing fast, but the tools also evolve very rapidly along with the syntaxes. Um, yeah, you are going to have to. My biggest resource has just been to not get stuck using old things. Read blog posts, see what's going on. You can stay up to date on the Babel website. They're very much on the forefront of what's going on with all the JavaScript changes. And just start using some of the new technologies. Play with them. Some of the new syntax, because you're going to have to use it eventually.
Eric has one about React. React is considered the only view of only the view of the MVC. What other frameworks would you consider the best match for React.js, and which ones should you avoid?
Um, for me, I said before, I really like the way that Facebook is completely disrupting the whole web app world,
Mm.
and I've been a big fan of Relay since it came out. So Relay Relay pretty much, I see some comments about Redux, and have had a question involving Redux. So Redux kind of does the same thing as Relay, except it also adds data fetching on, um, and it wraps it all up into one, managing your application state and the entire Flux flow.
Mhm.
So I think Relay is fantastic. I think Redux is awesome if you don't want to jump into Relay, which can be a bit much. It requires you to have a completely different web server serving up a GraphQL server. So I think Redux is fantastic. Even Alt is a great Flux implementation. Those are two good ones. And then beyond that, pick your favorite Express COA web server. You really can't go wrong
Mhm.
with a. I haven't seen any major issues with any JavaScript web servers. But because the question says, is it considered? It's considered only the view of the MVC. I think Facebook and the React community is kind of trying to destroy this MVC notion, where you have a model and you have a view and you have a controller. I think the view and the controller are going to kind of become one thing, and that's kind of where Relay is headed, is destroying view and controller as two separate things. So
Mm.
yeah, Relay would be my recommendation.
Yeah. So you keep mentioning that Facebook is disrupting the idea of the view and MVC. What are some examples of that?
Well, it would be the way. So the first thing was when they released GraphQL, which is kind of it's somewhat of a query language that you can use. It's built more for client-side developers, so that you don't have to ask a server-side developer, hey, now I need some extra data. I can get all the users from this one REST endpoint. And now, okay, you've added the functionality to give me their posts as well, but I don't need everything that they're all the data in the posts. I only need 2 fields. So what Facebook did with GraphQL was create something that you run server side. You have one REST endpoint, one instead of one API endpoint that you call to fetch all of your data, to perform mutations on your data, everything. And you use a syntax. It looks a lot like a JavaScript object, the query syntax, except with only keys. And you ask for the data that you need for that view, rather than hitting 4 or 5 different REST endpoints to piece together all of the data that you need. So it started with that, kind of letting the client, the front-end developer, specify their data needs, as opposed to the server-side developer dictating what you get. And then the Flux architecture and Relay is really out to destroy it. So in Relay, you co-locate all of your data requirements in the component. So now your component not only has JavaScript, HTML markup, but now it has the query that you want to run to fetch data for that component. So everything is in one spot. So now there's no need for a controller to kind of prepare your data for you. It's in your view. And again, like for me, it makes a lot of sense. When I come onto a new project, it makes sense to see, here's my markup, here is all the JavaScript and the logic that makes this markup, change, and here's all the data that I need to render this component, all in the same place. This is not normal. It's very disruptive, and I think a lot of people are getting behind it. It's just kind of hard sometimes to break from tradition.
Definitely. So, Carl wants to know, is it safe to assume that in the next coming months, Relay, I will be getting Relay as a complete MVC framework?
I'm sorry, Angela, I couldn't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Shakar was curious. He was asking whether it's safe to assume that in the next few months I will be getting Relay as a complete MVC framework.
No, it won't be complete. It'll pretty much be the V and the C, from my point of view. It's not going to handle how you structure your data on the server side. It doesn't care about that. It just handles fetching your data, preparing your data, maintaining your application state in a store, and and then sending mutations to the server. So the server is still going to be responsible for the model, and how the GraphQL server interacts with all of your models in the database. So, yeah.
So is GraphQL Facebook's OData?
I don't know that I'm familiar with OData, unfortunately. I've never heard of that.
Okay.
If Kevin could give a follow-up and just give a brief explanation of that, I'd be happy to answer it.
Okay. So Kevin, if you're listening still, please give us some more context behind your question. Okay. So moving on to a different kind of question, Hernandez was asking, as an Angular developer, he's interested in learning React. Is there a bit of a stiff learning curve involved moving between the two?
Yeah, I think there is. I just wrapped up an in-person class where I taught a 6-week class where I taught an entire class full of Angular developers React, and the first couple days was essentially in forgetting everything you know about Angular, because you can't think of them in the same way. Angular is, for one, it's a complete web framework. It has all the different components. React is just the view. And so Angular has this notion of the controller and then two-way data binding between the view and the controller. So anytime anything's updated in one spot, it it moves back and forth. And React, you cannot think that way at all. React, for one, the components, they are supposed to be kind of dumb and only know what you give them, as opposed to in Angular, the view dictates what data is in the controller when you change the view. React doesn't operate that way. You have one central data store. If you want to change something from the view, you dispatch an action, and it goes through the store and then back to the view, kind of in a big circle. Instead of in Angular, things are kind of crisscrossing and going this way and that way. And, it could be easy to lose track of your state updates. So my suggestion would be to just kind of try to forget the Angular mindset and go into it with no expectations and try to learn it as it is without trying to apply Angular to it.
Mm-hmm. So what if you want to write React components using TypeScript as that? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm pretty sure you can do it. I think I read something about that recently. I don't personally use TypeScript, and I don't. So I'm not really an authority on that. But I know there's somewhere on the React website that talks about that. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I don't know concretely.
Yeah. Do you think learning Redux is a waste of time at this point?
No, not at all. I am using both Redux and Relay in an application that I'm using right now. And so Redux is fantastic for managing non-persisted state if you're also using Relay. Relay is great for persisted state, that is state and data that interacts with the database and interacts with your server. But there can be lots of things. I have, in an application I'm writing right now, I have several different components that can change the state of another component that is not a direct child and a direct descendant of it. So passing data around between them, it just doesn't work. But with Redux, you can make that work. So I have this non-persisted state that I can manage with Redux, and if I didn't use Redux, it would be quite a mess. So no, I don't think. I think Redux is fantastic, and everyone should keep using it.
So, what are your thoughts on React Native?
I really like where they're going with it. I haven't had a ton of time to play with it yet, although I want to. But I like the direction they moved in React 14 and splitting apart React and React DOM, so that you can render React components on the same component on different devices, making them reusable. I think it's awesome. I just haven't had enough time to play with it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Do people need to know Node.js in order to work with React?
Well, Node.js is simply something that allows you to run JavaScript on a server, which previously, before Node came out, wasn't a thing. It would only run in the browser. So really, as long as you know JavaScript, you pretty much know Node. It's just server-side JavaScript. It doesn't change the language in any way.
Okay. And so if Rakesh was asking that he develops, let me reread this. I'm developing the backend in PHP. Is React relevant to me?
I think so. I think at the most basic level, it's important to know how your front-end developers work and what their workflow is. Because as a PHP developer, your front-end developers, if they're using React, are going to need to interact with your server at some point. And so knowing how their data looks, how they want to consume their data, how the framework works, can really help you as a server-side developer. So you're not spinning your wheels and having your front-end developers later say, "Oh, this is not how I wanted it," So.
Yeah. So how do you handle CSS with large-scale applications using React?
That's a point of contention. A lot of the community is pushing for using having most of your CSS actually in the JavaScript and using inline styles. Because React supports putting JavaScript objects as a style tag in your JSX markup, you're pretty flexible. Unfortunately, you can't do things like CSS transitions or these pseudo elements, like a hover or focused. Those don't work yet. There's some plugins out there that kind of make it work. It feels a little hacky to me the way they make them work, but I am still a fan of just having modular CSS, having well-defined CSS files, a CSS file that matches a component, and I typically use Sass to create mix-ins and reuse chunks of CSS where I can. But it's tough. I'm not sure where people are going with the inline styles. If it gets better, it may be a thing, but for now, I'm still a fan of just modular Sass.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Ganesh was asking if you recommend writing inline CSS styles. Do you have anything more to add to that? Because I feel like you may have added.
I do, yeah. So I do prefer it for things like creating a module that is going to be reusable on NPM. For instance, I recently created a drag and drop scheduler component that I needed for my app, but it didn't exist, so I thought I'd release it on NPM. And I made all the styling that was imperative for the component to render properly is all inline, 100%. That way, there's no CSS to import. You import the component, and all the styles are in line. And then the technique I used was to add a class to every container. I added a class to every CSS container, which is not required that you use, but then you can take as a consumer of this module and overwrite the color without completely messing up the entire layout of the component. So I'm a big advocate of using inline styles in that way for things that are very, very super important to this component rendering properly.
Okay. So this one's about Relay. The way that you said that data will be available for the view, does Relay create a couplage problem?
It tries very hard to, and I think it does a good job of not tightly coupling things together. So because every component specifies their own data requirements, it's not tightly coupled necessarily to its parent, because it has its own separate data requirement that is not dependent on the parent. The only way it's dependent on the parent is that if the parent component is rendering the child component, it just has to introspect into the child component, get its data requirements, and merge it in, which Relay has pretty much automatic features for merging GraphQL queries together. So it makes it very modular and reusable.
Okay. So, one question has just come up. Can you explain what state is with React?
So state is, so you have two concepts in a React component. You have props and you have state. Props are what the component is initially rendered with. And so if you imagine some HTML markup where you have attributes on the HTML, when you're writing JSX in React, those are the props. And those get applied to the component when the component's rendered, and then they're immutable. You're not allowed to change those props. So updating the component, you can do one of two ways. You can update the parent component that passes different props in, and that changes and causes the entire component to re-render, or you can change the state. There's a state object. And so the state object is when you're internally mutating some aspect of that component, and it doesn't care about the outside world. It's just inside of it. So if you have, in one of my code samples, I think I mutated the state of the style attribute, which is not allowed anymore, but let's say you were changing the status of a button based on an input for form validation. That would be an appropriate place, I think, to use state inside of a component, where the state of an input changes. As that changes, then you change the state of the submit button, let's say. And that's not handled by any external things. So state can change, props can't, I guess is the short answer.
Well, here's a long question for you. One of the last ones as well. So just to put that out there, we're going to be wrapping up in about 5-10 minutes. But Alexandre wanted to know, what are your thoughts about managing components on big web applications? The fact that the pages are components and buttons, lists, and etc. are also set as components. What is the best way to handle it?
That's a good question. I think there and there's not, because React is just a view. There's not a lot out there that says, you know, you should structure your application in this way or this way. Where if you generate a Rails app, you know, it gives you this structure and you should do things this way, a specific way. I think what makes the most sense at this point, until there's some sort of standard that people agree on, I think what makes the most sense to you. My typical organization is I break things up by typically models. So a piece of data. If I have a user in my application, then I'll have a user folder with, you know, a show.jsx file, and that is a component that shows the user. And I'll have a list.jsx file, and that's a component that shows a list of users. And for me, that works for my brain. That's very MVC style, but that's just the way it works for me. And I've seen it broken up in lots of different ways. And so I don't know that there's any best practice at this point. I think it's just what works best for your brain. But being modular is what I've found the best way to keep big apps organized, is to break things into as many small, well-defined pieces as possible.
Okay. And on React components, do you know of any places on the web where you can find pre-built and reusable React components similar to Angular directives?
Yeah, well, I mean, npm.js is a great source. There's quite a few there. I'm drawing a blank. There is a website dedicated to it. And I don't know if we're going to have a place for like notes at the end, Angela, but I can certainly do some research on that, and I can't remember what it's called. I get most of mine via npm, but there's one or two websites out there that are dedicated to just listing React components, and if we have a spot, I can certainly track them down and find the links and post them.
Yeah. Having said that, we still need to get around to Kevin's question, so maybe we might do that through those external notes afterwards. I will find one and I will be sharing that with everybody who has attended and registered for today's webinar. Okay. There is a question that follows on from Alexandre's question. How do web designers that work with CSS and not HTML deal with React?
I mean, the markup works the same, right? You can still see class names and divs and everything. So if you're a designer that uses CSS, I would imagine on some level you have to at least be able to look at the HTML and see what class names you can use, and that's all still there, right? With using JSX and a React component, you sift through the JavaScript and just look at the HTML, and there will be class names, and there will be divs and spans, and everything that you're used to seeing. Even if you're not familiar with writing those components, it'll all still look the same for the most part.
Okay, and I think we should be wrapping up soon, but before we go, one last question. Victor wanted to know if you can recommend some more advanced tutorials. Are there any sites or any other resources that you can recommend for Victor?
I would check React.jsnews.com. They've got a whole bunch of great blog posts with tutorials, short tutorials on very specific topics that branch beyond just the beginner stuff. That's a great resource. Beyond that, I would look up React actually has a few. So React Relay Router, React Router has an example to-do list that kind of walks you through using React Router to create a to-do list. And Dan Abramov, one of the core members of React, has a lot of great stuff out there on his blog. So I would look him up.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Darin, for joining us. We still had a couple of questions in the webinar. I'm not sure if you have time to answer those or if you need to shoot off. I know that you have a few things to do. Either way...
I have a few more minutes if that's fine with me.
Excellent. All right. So then Alexandre was wanting to know, will you add the actions and stores inside each module?
I'm wondering if that relates to Relay or Redux. So I don't know if you could follow up real quick on that.
Alexandre, could you reach out in chat about that? I'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Does React mix well with Rails? What are the advantages of using React in a Rails app like a social network, for example?
Yeah, I think React mixes better with Rails than any other JavaScript framework I've used so far, because it's just a view, and Rails really handles the model and the controller part very, very well. It plugs in very nicely, and actually Facebook has a Ruby gem out there. I think it's called React Rails that allows you just like basically plug and play React and Rails mixing. And then also someone else has put out I think it's called React on Rails, which combines Webpack and a couple other things. I think Redux. And it's a little more robust integration with Rails. So, and the advantages. Well, I think any of the advantages you're going to get from using React anywhere else will still apply. Very fast page updates, easy to reason about components and modules, and for a social network, well, it handles state change very well based on new data coming into the component. So it mixes with Rails fantastically.
Okay, great. So following on from Alexandre's question originally, which was, will you add the actions and stores inside each module? Alexandre was saying that this is referring to the amount of components that a web application can have.
About the amount, I'm seeing it here. Okay, about the amount of components. So, yes. Well, typically, if you're using something like Redux, the actions and the stores are typically created separately and kind of stored in their own folders, and then they're imported where they're needed. So typically, like if you're using Redux, the store is just injected into your root component, so it's available to your entire application. And then you just import actions into components as you need them, and then it doesn't matter what's happening. You know, the store is listening to every component for actions being triggered. So best practices I've seen so far is keep actions and stores separated, and you just import actions into the modules that need them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the last question for this webinar today, do you recommend writing in JSX or plain JS while writing React components?
I would recommend JSX. It's a lot easier to read. You can create a hierarchical structure, and if you have, going back to a previous question, if you have a designer that's working with you, they're not going to be able to decipher a React component that's created with just JavaScript, because it's just a whole bunch of JavaScript, nested JavaScript objects, and that's really, really difficult to figure out, well, what the heck is going on here. So I would prefer JSX. I think that's pretty much common, that everyone prefers JSX.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a wrap.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Darin. Remember, for everybody else that is watching this, this will be replayable. I will share the link. It will be automatically added to our YouTube page as soon as I stop broadcasting. But I will be sending out an email through SitePoint with the link so that you can have access to this as well. Thank you for joining us once again. And, oh, do you have some news, Darin, for us?
Do I have some news?
Yeah.
I'm going to be. I'm currently producing a beginner's guide to ES6 course. So look for that. I think early May.
Yeah.
Late April, somewhere abouts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Check out the coming soon page in SitePoint Premium, and you will see that when it's coming out. It will be around May, in a couple of months. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us and asking us so many interesting questions. It's great to see so much engagement in the chat. A lot of you have been asking questions and answering each other's questions as well, which is always great to see. A great community sense there. But yes, thank you very much, and I hope to see you in our next webinars. Thank you, and please feel free to provide us with feedback if you enjoyed it, if you didn't, what can we do to improve it. I'm always looking for that. So until next time, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will send you that link soon.